So today we're going to be discussing carbon. Our goals and objectives are to explain why carbon is important for life, to describe isomers, and the roles of functional groups. So carbon is the basis of life. There's actually an entire subject dedicated to carbon. It's called organic chemistry, which if you're a science major, you're probably going to end up taking that. So by the end of it, you should be pretty familiar with carbon. So we are primarily composed of carbon. Our proteins, DNA, carbohydrates are all composed of carbon atoms that are bonded to each other and other elements. And our cells are, of course, are composed of 70 to 95% water, but almost everything else is carbon compound. So without water, we're pretty much carbon. A couple of other things that are composed of carbon. It's a pretty big component you'll find in diamonds and graphite. Again, carbon is the basis of all life. So carbon is unique because it has 4 valence electrons, which allows it to form 4 covalent bonds, which if you remember from our last lecture, we discussed that covalent bonds are the strongest type of bonds. So CO2 is the source of carbon for all organic molecules in organisms. So it's very important. CO2 is vital to life. Now, however, you can have what's called CO2 poisoning, and it can be pretty bad. It can cause dizziness, confusion, shortness of breath, sweating, headaches, and it can even cause death. So there is too much of the CO2. So hydrocarbons are diverse molecules that consist of only hydrogen and carbon. So these are fuels, and each time a carbon is added, not only does it change, but it becomes stronger and stronger with each carbon that's added. So our weakest fuel is methane, and that's because we have 1 carbon that you see here. Now, just because it's the weakest fuel doesn't mean that it's actually weak. In fact, it's pretty explosive. If you have improperly drained sewage, then the bacteria can create methane gas, and if that causes an explosion underneath water or ice, it can be pretty detrimental. So if you add a carbon, you have ethane, and if you have a double bond, that would make it ethene, and then if you have 3 carbons, that would make it propane. And propane should sound pretty familiar. If you've ever had a barbecue or cooked out any burgers, you know that you're using propane gas. But you also need to be very careful if you're using any gas of any kind. So with our carbon, we know that we have those 4 valence electrons in that outermost shell, so we can form 4 very strong covalent bonds, as you see here in the outer shell. So carbon skeleton variation produces molecular diversity, and they can be made 4 different ways. They can be made linearly, as you see here. They can be branching. You can also have double bonds. And these are really strong. They're very hard to break, and they're very volatile. And then the strongest would be in the form of a ring. And you can see here we have multiple double bonds. So if anything's in a ring structure, again, it's very volatile. It'll actually even have a very strong smell. You can think of benzene, which is incredibly toxic and explosive. So trying to break apart these bonds is incredibly difficult and dangerous. So you should remember that a hydrocarbon is a molecule consisting of only carbon and hydrogen. And here we have a lipid, which we'll discuss more later on. But this lipid has a glycerol backbone, and then it has 3 fatty acid tails. And these fatty acid tails are made of methane. So we know that that's CH4. And if you remember from the previous slide when we were talking about methane, it's pretty reactive. It's got a lot of energy. So whenever you're taking in fat, you're taking in a lot of energy. It's very energy efficient. So an isomer has the same molecular formula, but different structures and chemical properties. And there's 3 different types. We have structural, and you can think of those as 1-story or 2-story. So this type of isomer, it has the same number of carbons, but it's in a different arrangement. So it also has different chemical properties. And then we have our geometric isomers, and there are two different types of geometric isomers, that being cis and trans. Now you can think of cis as same and trans as different. So in our cis molecule, our functional groups will be on the same side of the double bond, our functional groups being these X's here. In our trans, our functional groups will be on the opposite sides of our double bond. And then we have enantiomers, and you can think of enantiomers as mirror images. They look alike, but they're not superimposable. So you can think of your hands. You see that your hands look identical, but if you tried to top one on the other, they don't match up. So that's the best way to think of an enantiomer. So enantiomers, there's two different types. You have an L form and a D form. So this really has to do with more so with the rotation of light. So the L form actually rotates light, and it's more effective in humans and animals. So whenever you're taking some kind of medication, or if you go to a health food store and pick up some amino acids, they're going to be the L form. We can still take the D form, but they're not really effective in humans. You'll find them more so in plants. So functional groups are chemically reactive groups of atoms within an organic molecule, and whenever you attach one to another compound or molecule, it will alter its behavior. So you need to be able to recognize the name, the structure, and the letter symbol of functional groups. So whenever you see an R, just know that that's any compound or molecule attached to the functional group. So our first functional group is hydroxyl, and that's an OH. We have methyl, which is CH3. A carbonyl is a C double bonded to an O. Carboxyl, which is COOH. An amino group, NH2. We have our phosphate, and then our sulfohydryl. And you can kind of put some clues together. You see that the amino, just think N. And then, of course, the phosphate has a P, and the sulfohydryl has an S. So just some little clues to help you guys. All right, okay, and then hormones. And hormones give organic molecules distinctive chemical properties. So the main example of hormones that you would see in males versus females, of course, females have estradiol, which is a precursor to estrogen, and males have testosterone. Now, it's important to know that both males and females have both estrogen and testosterone. It's just that estrogen is the dominating hormone in females, and as we age, we produce less estrogen, and then males have the dominating hormone of testosterone, and it's the same in males. The older you get, the less production there is. Okay, so let's do a quick recap. Today we talked about carbon and how it is the basis of all life. We talked about the different types of isomers, which you will need to be able to identify and tell a difference between for any test and quizzes. We also talked about functional groups, which again you need to be able to identify the name, the structure, and the letters for. All right, guys, see you next time.